Welcome back to our channel on this beautiful day. We are thrilled to bring you the latest, most dramatic updates from Genoa City. Dive in with us as we explore the intense fallout, the shocking arrests, and the emotional turning points awaiting your favorite characters in the relentless world of power and betrayal. The Abbott Mansion, usually a grand sanctuary of elegance and generational wealth, had recently felt more like a fortress besieged by invisible enemies. The lingering shadows of trauma hung heavy in the air, a constant, suffocating reminder of the harrowing ordeal that had nearly destroyed the very foundation of their prominent family. Jack Abbott, the steadfast patriarch, bore the invisible scars of a brutal physical assault, while his beloved Diane Jenkins Abbott carried the psychological torment of a terrifying captivity. The silence within the sprawling estate was profound, heavy with unspoken fears and the agonizing wait for a justice that seemed perpetually out of reach. Every creak of the ancient floorboards, every long shadow cast by the setting sun, seemed to echo the malicious presence of Dr. Lawrence Markham and the deranged Patty Williams. It was within this fragile, suffocating quiet that the sudden, sharp ring of a telephone shattered the stillness, sending a jolt of electrifying anticipation through Jack. He knew, with the primal instinct of a man who had fought countless bitter wars to protect his loved ones, that this was the call they had been desperately waiting for. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Detective James Burrow, a man whose authoritative tone carried the heavy weight of the law and the absolute promise of retribution. Jack listened intently, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the receiver, his heart pounding a frantic, echoing rhythm against his ribs. Burrow delivered the news that would finally close one of the darkest, most terrifying chapters in the Abbott family. The Genoa City Police Department had successfully executed a massive tactical raid on the isolated summer rental house that had served as Dr. Markham's final, desperate hideout. The disgraced, sociopathic physician, who had orchestrated a reign of terror with chilling, calculated precision, had finally been cornered like a frightened, powerless animal. Jack could almost perfectly visualize the chaotic scene, the flashing blue and red sirens piercing the rural darkness, the heavily armed officers swarming the perimeter of the property, and Markham's paralyzing panic as his twisted delusions of invincibility shattered into a million jagged pieces. Detective Burrow spared no detail in describing the capture, ensuring Jack fully understood that the man who had inflicted such profound, lingering suffering was now entirely stripped of his malicious power. Markham, suffocating under the crushing weight of his own frantic paranoia and overwhelming visceral terror, had offered absolutely no resistance as the cold steel of handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists. He was forcefully dragged out of his sanctuary, completely stripped of his arrogant, manipulative facade, and thrown into the back of a police cruiser destined for a sterile holding cell where he would finally face the devastating legal consequences of his heinous crime. For Jack, the absolute confirmation of Markham's arrest was a profound, soul-cleansing release, a sudden uncoiling of the agonizing, suffocating tension that had gripped his chest for endless weeks. The man who had weaponized his medical authority to psychologically torture Diane and orchestrate a lethal, bloody attack on Jack was no longer a phantom menace lurking in the shadows. He was a broken, defeated criminal, firmly and permanently in the uncompromising grasp of the justice system. Slowly replacing the receiver on its cradle, Jack took a deep, shuddering breath, allowing the immense reality of the triumphant moment to wash over his exhausted body. The physical toll of the brutal stabbing he had endured at the hands of Patty Williams still ached deep within his bones, a phantom pain that flared with every heartbeat, but that agony was momentarily eclipsed by a soaring, overwhelming sense of triumph. He turned his intense gaze toward the grand doorway of the study, his thoughts shifting entirely to the resilient woman who had endured the unimaginable depths of fear. Diane Jenkins Abbott had survived a truly harrowing ordeal, her spirit tested by a sociopath who had sought to break her entirely and erase her from Jack's life. Jack approached her with a measured, profound tenderness, his eyes reflecting a complex mixture of deep sorrow for what she had suffered and an overwhelming, fierce relief that the nightmare was over. He knew that the words he was about to speak would serve as the ultimate, healing balm for her wounded soul, the definitive, undeniable proof that her terrifying ordeal had finally come to an absolute end. When Jack gently delivered the news of Dr. Lawrence Markham's capture. The emotional release within the opulent room was instantly palpable and deeply. He watched closely as the heavy, invisible chains of terror that had bound Diane for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a sudden flood of tears that spoke of profound relief and the lingering, painful aftershocks of trauma. Jack pulled her into a deeply protective, fiercely loving embrace, his strong arms serving as an impenetrable shield against the lingering horrors of the past few weeks. He murmured words of absolute reassurance against her hair, detailing exactly how the man who had held her hostage and subjected her to relentless psychological torture was currently sitting in a cold interrogation room, completely stripped of his dangerous influence. For Diane, the concrete knowledge that her tormentor was locked away behind iron bars brought a desperately needed sense of final closure, allowing her to finally draw a full breath without the suffocating, paralyzing fear that Markham might somehow return to finish his twisted work. But Markham was only one half of the terrifying, destructive equation that had nearly annihilated the Abbott family, and Jack knew he had to address the other lingering threat to ensure Diane's complete and total peace of mind. He gently pulled back just enough to look into her tear-filled eyes, explaining the definitive fate of Patty Williams, the deeply disturbed woman whose severe mental illness had been ruthlessly weaponized to inflict maximum damage upon them. Patty, a tragic but highly dangerous victim of her own shattered mind and Markham's malicious manipulation, had been securely transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility. She was now languishing behind heavily reinforced doors and impenetrable glass, awaiting trial in an environment specifically designed to contain her violent, unremorseful obsession with Jack. He held Diane's gaze with unwavering intensity, swearing on his very life that Patty had absolutely no chance of escape, ensuring that the deranged phantom who had haunted their lives for far too long was permanently and irrevocably neutralized. Despite the overwhelming, intoxicating relief of these dual victories, a darker, far more insidious shadow still loomed ominously over the Abbott mansion, a sprawling shadow cast by the ruthless, calculating patriarch of the Newman dynasty. Jack's mind inevitably and dangerously turned toward Victor Newman, the cold, manipulative billionaire who was heavily suspected of orchestrating the entire bloody nightmare from behind the scenes. The evidence, though currently circumstantial, pointed heavily toward Victor having paid a massive, untraceable bribe to Dr. Markham, intentionally funding the release of Patty Williams, specifically to orchestrate the brutal, near-fatal stabbing of his lifelong corporate and personal rival. The mere thought of Victor manipulating such a horrific, life-threatening sequence of events from the untouchable safety of his sprawling ranch ignited a terrifying, simmering rage deep within Jack's soul. A dark, merciless thirst for vengeance began to course hotly through his veins, a desperate, consuming need to tear down the entire Newman empire and force Victor to pay in blood for the trauma he had so callously caused. Diane, possessing an intuitive, profound understanding of the man she loved more than life itself, immediately sensed the dangerous, volatile shift in Jack's demeanor. She saw the familiar, destructive fire of the endless Abbott-Newman war igniting in his eyes, a familiar darkness that had consumed so many years of their lives, and she knew that pursuing this violent path would only plunge them right back into a vortex of chaos and pain. With a voice trembling with profound emotional exhaustion and absolute vulnerability, Diane pleaded desperately with Jack to lay down his weapons, to completely pause his relentless, burning pursuit of retribution against Victor Newman. She articulated a desperate, fundamental need to simply exist in the present moment, to cherish their miraculous, hard-won reunion, and to focus entirely on healing the deep, jagged psychological wounds inflicted by their recent, terrifying ordeal. Diane argued with heartbreaking clarity that engaging in a brutal, all-consuming war with Victor right now would only allow the Newman patriarch to continue dictating their lives, effectively robbing them of the peace they had fought so desperately to reclaim. Jack stood at a critical, agonizing crossroads, violently torn between his primal, masculine instinct to protect his family through ruthless retaliation and his profound, unwavering love for the fragile woman standing before him. He looked deeply at Diane, truly seeing the delicate state of her spirit, the profound exhaustion etched into the fine lines of her beautiful face, and the desperate, pleading hope shining in her eyes. The realization hit him with staggering, undeniable force. His vengeance, no matter how entirely justified and necessary it felt, would only serve to further traumatize and alienate the woman he had sworn to protect with his dying breath. In a moment of profound emotional maturity and deep self-sacrificing devotion, Jack made the agonizing, difficult choice to swallow his burning pride and extinguish the immediate, roaring fires of his wrath. He gently cupped Diane's face in his trembling hands, promising her with absolute sincerity that he would put his bitter vendetta against Victor Newman on an indefinite hold, prioritizing their love, their mutual healing, and their desperately needed sanctuary above all other concerns. This fragile, hard-won peace slowly enveloped the grand room, creating a tender, isolated moment of pure connection between two battered souls who had miraculously survived the unimaginable. They held each other tightly, finding profound solace in the steady, comforting rhythm of their shared heartbeats, allowing themselves to believe, for a fleeting, beautiful moment, that the worst of their trials was truly behind them. The Abbott mansion, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt like a true home again, a place of impenetrable safety, warmth, and unconditional love. Jack allowed himself to physically relax, his hyper-vigilant protective instincts momentarily lulled by the familiar warmth of Diane's embrace and the profound, undeniable relief that Markham and Patty were finally locked away where they could never hurt anyone again. It was a beautiful, entirely necessary illusion of finality, a brief, golden respite from the relentless, unforgiving storms that perpetually battered the shores of their lives in Genoa City. However, in the treacherous, ever-shifting world of the Abbotts and the Newmans, peace is always a strictly temporary condition, a fleeting, deceptive breath caught between the devastating, inevitable blows of an endless, generational war. The quiet, healing intimacy of Jack and Diane's emotional reunion was suddenly and irrevocably shattered by the abrupt, forceful opening of the mansion doors, signaling the arrival of a powerful force that absolutely refused to be pacified. Kyle Abbott strode purposefully into the room, his physical presence crackling with a fierce, unyielding, and highly dangerous energy that instantly altered the atmospheric pressure of the space. Kyle had stood shoulder to shoulder with his father during the harrowing, violent rescue mission, risking his own life and freedom to pull his beloved mother from the terrifying clutches of Dr. Markham. The immense trauma of that night had fundamentally and permanently changed him, violently stripping away his polished, diplomatic corporate veneer and leaving behind a hardened, fiercely protective warrior who now viewed the world in absolute, unforgiving terms of loyalty and betrayal. Kyle's sharp eyes darted quickly between his parents, immediately assessing the tender, pacified nature of their interaction, and a deep, simmering frustration began to radiate visibly from his rigid, aggressive posture. He had absolutely not come to celebrate the mundane arrests of the pawns. He had come to meticulously orchestrate the utter destruction of the king who had moved them. Kyle was acutely, painfully aware of the overwhelming, damning evidence pointing to Victor Newman's ultimate, undeniable culpability in the horrific events that had nearly cost his parents their lives and their sanity. While Jack had just promised Diane a much-needed reprieve from the violence, Kyle harbored absolutely no such desire for peace, forgiveness, or delay. The lingering, burning trauma of seeing his mother held hostage and discovering his father brutally stabbed had ignited a dark, calculating ruthlessness within the young Abbott heir, a relentless, burning drive to ensure that the true, untouchable architect of their profound suffering faced a catastrophic, public reckoning. Refusing to let the victorious momentum of the day dissipate into gentle, cowardly complacency, Kyle stepped aggressively forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute, unwavering attention from his parents. He briefly acknowledged the capture of Markham and the institutionalization of Patty, but he immediately and coldly dismissed them as mere, insignificant symptoms of a much larger, far more malignant disease that infected their lives. Kyle looked directly at his father, his expression completely devoid of mercy, hesitation, or the boyish charm he once possessed, and demanded to know the exact, ruthless strategy for their ultimate retaliation against Victor Newman. He flatly and angrily rejected the very concept of a ceasefire, arguing with chilling, undeniable logic that allowing Victor to walk away unpunished would only embolden the ruthless patriarch to strike again with even deadlier force. As Carl demanded a concrete plan to hit Victor back with devastating, unprecedented power, the fragile illusion of peace within the Abbott mansion shattered completely into dust, leaving Jack trapped between his sacred promise to Diane and his son's apocalyptic thirst for vengeance, setting the perfect, terrifying stage for a brutal, unavoidable war that would soon engulf all of Genoa City in its flames.